The United States is preparing to increase its maritime presence around the Philippines, and this time the focus is not on destroyers, aircraft carriers, or heavily armed frigates. Instead, the attention is on four relatively small but highly capable ships operated by the U.S. Coast Guard. Reports indicate that 4 Sentinel-class Fast Response Cutters could be rotationally deployed to the Philippines, adding another layer to the country's growing maritime security network. At first glance, 4 patrol cutters may not sound like a major development, but in the waters surrounding the Philippines, where enormous distances separate islands, fishing communities, shipping routes, and contested maritime areas, speed and persistent presence can be extremely valuable. These cutters could give the United States and the Philippines another tool for responding quickly to incidents at sea while strengthening cooperation between two long-standing treaty allies. The Sentinel-class Fast Response Cutter was designed around a very different philosophy from the large warships normally associated with naval power. These vessels are approximately 47 meters long and are built to move quickly, with speeds exceeding 28 knots. They are not intended to replace major frigates or destroyers. Instead, their strength comes from mobility, endurance, communications, sensors, and the ability to rapidly respond to developing situations. A cutter operating in Philippine waters could potentially cover large areas, investigate maritime contacts, support law enforcement activities, assist vessels in distress, and respond to emergencies. That combination becomes particularly important in an archipelagic country where the maritime environment changes constantly. A ship does not necessarily need to be the largest platform in the area to have strategic value. Sometimes the most important advantage is simply being able to reach the scene quickly. Another important characteristic is the cutter's endurance. The Sentinel class has a range of roughly 2,500 nautical miles, allowing it to remain at sea for extended periods before needing to return for replenishment. That matters because maritime security is rarely about responding to one isolated incident. Coast guards and maritime forces have to monitor shipping activity, assist fishermen respond to emergencies, conduct patrols, and maintain awareness over huge areas. The Philippines faces this challenge on an especially large scale. Its territory stretches across thousands of islands and includes some of the busiest maritime routes in Southeast Asia. There are also remote communities and fishing grounds that may be hundreds of kilometers from major bases. A fast patrol vessel with good endurance can therefore become a highly flexible asset, moving toward areas where its presence is needed rather than remaining tied to a single location. The cutter's relatively small crew is another part of its design philosophy. A typical Sentinel-class vessel can operate with roughly 24 personnel, allowing the ship to perform its missions without requiring the large manpower demands associated with bigger surface combatants. The crew can operate the ship, manage communications and sensors, conduct maritime operations, and deploy boarding teams when required. This makes the platform particularly suitable for missions where flexibility is more important than carrying a massive weapons load. Its role can include maritime law enforcement, patrol operations, search and rescue, and support for other government agencies. In other words, the Fast Response Cutter is designed to be a practical working vessel rather than simply a symbol of military power. Its value comes from how often and how effectively it can be used. The cutter's relatively small crew is another part of its design philosophy. A typical Sentinel-class vessel can operate with roughly 24 personnel, allowing the ship to perform its missions without requiring the large manpower demands associated with bigger surface combatants. The crew can operate the ship, manage communications and sensors, conduct maritime operations, and deploy boarding teams when required. This makes the platform particularly suitable for missions where flexibility is more important than carrying a massive weapons load. Its role can include maritime law enforcement, patrol operations, search and rescue, and support for other government agencies. In other words, the Fast Response Cutter is designed to be a practical working vessel rather than simply a symbol of military power. Its value comes from how often and how effectively it can be used. The weapons carried by the Sentinel class also deserve attention, although they are only one part of the ship's overall capability. Depending on configuration, The cutter can operate a remotely controlled 25mm Mark 38 chain gun along with additional machine guns. These weapons provide protection and give the crew an option for dealing with dangerous situations at sea. But the real strength of the cutter is not its firepower alone. In maritime security, information can be just as important as weapons. Detecting a vessel, identifying it, communicating with it, and deciding how to respond are all critical steps. A fast cutter with effective sensors and communications can help build a clearer picture of what is happening across a section of ocean. That information can then be shared with other ships, aircraft, and command centers operating as part of a wider maritime network. One of the most useful features of the Sentinel-class is located toward the stern of the ship. The cutter is equipped with a stern launch and recovery system for a smaller rigid hull, inflatable boat. This allows the main ship to remain in position while a smaller boat is sent toward another vessel or a specific location. Imagine a situation involving a suspicious fishing vessel, a disabled boat, or people requiring assistance. Rather than bringing the entire cutter alongside, the smaller boat can be launched to approach the situation more directly. The same concept can support boarding operations, rescue missions, inspections, and other maritime tasks. This gives the cutter two levels of mobility. The large vessel can cover significant distances while the smaller boat can operate closer to individual targets or people in need. For the Philippines, this capability has particular significance because the country's maritime environment is extraordinarily complex. Philippine waters contain commercial shipping routes, fishing grounds, offshore resources, military facilities, remote islands, and areas where maritime disputes remain sensitive. The challenge is not simply obtaining powerful ships. The challenge is maintaining enough vessels and aircraft to monitor such a large area. A platform capable of reaching an incident quickly can help close that gap. The presence of additional U.S. Coast Guard cutters could also allow American and Philippine personnel to coordinate more closely during maritime operations. That cooperation could involve exercises, communications, training, search and rescue, and other activities designed to improve interoperability between the two countries. There is also a broader strategic reason why these cutters are attracting attention. The United States and the Philippines are treaty allies, and their defense relationship has expanded considerably in recent years. Military exercises have become more frequent. Maritime cooperation has received greater attention, and both governments have emphasized the importance of maintaining a free and open maritime environment. A rotational deployment of fast response cutters would fit into this wider pattern of cooperation. Rather than relying exclusively on occasional exercises or short-term port visits, rotational deployments can create a more consistent operational presence. The objective would not necessarily be to transform these cutters into frontline naval combatants. Instead, their presence could strengthen the everyday maritime security relationship between the two countries. The distinction between Coast Guard vessels and major naval combatants is important. A fast response cutter is not a destroyer, and it does not possess the same sensors, weapons, size, or combat endurance as a major warship. But maritime security involves many missions that do not require a destroyer. Searching for a missing vessel, responding to a distress call, inspecting a suspicious boat, supporting law enforcement, or quickly moving personnel between locations are examples of missions where a smaller cutter can be highly effective. Using the appropriate platform for the appropriate mission can actually make a maritime force more efficient. Large warships can concentrate on high-end defense missions while smaller patrol vessels handle routine security and response tasks. This layered approach allows different platforms to complement one another. The potential deployment also has implications for the Philippine Coast Guard and other Philippine maritime agencies. The Philippines has been steadily expanding its own maritime capabilities, but the scale of the country's maritime domain means that cooperation with partners remains important. American cutters operating rotationally in the region could provide opportunities for joint training and operational coordination. Philippine crews could gain additional experience working alongside U.S. personnel, while American crews would gain greater familiarity with the unique operating environment of Southeast Asian waters. Over time, these interactions can improve communications and make it easier for different agencies to work together during emergencies. The result is not simply more ships at sea. It is a more connected maritime security system in which information and resources can move between participating agencies. Another factor is the geography of the West Philippine Sea. The area contains long distances, changing weather conditions, commercial traffic, fishing activity, and strategically important maritime routes. Maintaining a constant presence across such an environment is difficult for any country. Even a relatively small number of additional vessels can become useful when they are integrated into an existing network of patrol aircraft, Coast Guard ships, naval vessels, radar systems, and communication infrastructure. The effectiveness of a cutter, therefore, cannot be measured only by its individual specifications. Its real value depends on how well it connects with everything else operating around it. A ship that can quickly detect a situation, communicate with nearby units, deploy a smaller boat, and remain on station can contribute far beyond what its size might suggest. The four-cutter figure is therefore important, but the broader meaning may be even more significant. Four vessels would not suddenly transform the balance of power in the region. They would not replace the Philippine Navy, the Philippine Coast Guard, or other maritime organizations. Instead, they could provide additional capacity within a much larger system. Think of them as additional pieces in an expanding network. One cutter could respond to an incident while another remains on patrol. Another could support an exercise or training activity, while another operates from a different location. Rotational deployment also means that the ships can potentially be used flexibly, rather than permanently assigned to one particular area. The concept is about adding presence without requiring every mission to be handled by a much larger and more expensive warship. There is also an important message behind the involvement of the U.S. Coast Guard, Maritime. Security is not always about preparing for war. Much of the daily work involves preventing accidents, protecting fishermen responding to emergencies, enforcing maritime regulations, and maintaining order at sea. Coast Guard platforms are particularly well suited to these missions because they combine maritime mobility with law enforcement and rescue functions. In a region where commercial and civilian activity is constantly increasing, having vessels capable of performing these duties can be extremely valuable. Their presence can also demonstrate that maritime security is being treated as an ongoing responsibility, rather than something that only receives attention when tensions rise. There is also an important message behind the involvement of the U.S. Coast Guard, Maritime. Security is not always about preparing for war. Much of the daily work involves preventing accidents, protecting fishermen responding to emergencies, enforcing maritime regulations, and maintaining order at sea. Coast Guard platforms are particularly well suited to these missions because they combine maritime mobility with law enforcement and rescue functions. In a region where commercial and civilian activity is constantly increasing, having vessels capable of performing these duties can be extremely valuable. Their presence can also demonstrate that maritime security is being treated as an ongoing responsibility, rather than something that only receives attention when tensions rise. At the same time, any discussion of the cutters should be viewed in the context of the Philippines' wider defense modernization. The country has been acquiring new aircraft, ships, radar systems, missiles, and other capabilities while attempting to develop a more credible external defense posture. But modernization is not simply about buying increasingly powerful weapons. It is also about creating a system where different organizations can operate together. A fighter aircraft can provide surveillance and air defense. A naval frigate can provide high-end combat capability. A Coast Guard cutter can conduct patrol and law enforcement missions. An aircraft can rapidly search an enormous area. Shore-based sensors can provide information to ships at sea. When these capabilities are connected, the overall effect can be much greater than the capability of any single platform. For the United States, rotational Coast Guard deployments could also demonstrate that maritime cooperation with the Philippines extends beyond traditional military exercises. Coast Guard cooperation can focus on practical missions that directly affect maritime communities. Search and rescue, maritime law enforcement, disaster response, fisheries protection, and emergency assistance all have real-world importance. At the same time, regular interaction between American and Philippine crews can strengthen interoperability and familiarity. These relationships can become especially important during major emergencies when several agencies need to coordinate quickly. In that sense, the cutters could serve both a practical and strategic purpose, operating as working maritime security platforms while also reinforcing the broader relationship between the two countries. Ultimately, the significance of 4 Sentinel-class Fast Response Cutters should not be measured by their size or by the number 4 alone. Their importance comes from what they could add to an already expanding maritime security network. They offer speed, endurance, flexibility, communications, a deployable small boat, and the ability to perform a wide range of missions without requiring the resources of a major warship. For the Philippines, that could mean another option for responding to incidents across its enormous maritime territory. For the United States, it provides another way to support a treaty ally while maintaining a practical maritime presence in the region. The waters surrounding the Philippines are becoming increasingly important to regional security, international trade, and the daily lives of millions of people. As the Philippines strengthens its own maritime forces, cooperation with partners will remain an important part of that effort. If the reported rotational deployment moves forward, these 4 cutters will not represent a complete solution to the country's maritime challenges. They will, however, add another layer to the network of ships, aircraft, sensors, and personnel working across the region. And that may ultimately be their greatest value. Not overwhelming firepower, but speed, presence, coordination, and the ability to respond when something happens far from shore. In the vast maritime environment of the Philippines, those capabilities can make a meaningful difference.